Joshua, and I'm an Intp. And first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video and subsequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video will be on superordinate traits of personality. And the nature of this video will be to explain some of the greater characteristics and influential factors within the way a person's psyche and consciousness works that does not lend itself to typology and the arrangement of cognitive functions alone. That there are greater superordinate factors within human existence that structure themselves within a person's psyche that influence and superimposes itself on the structure of a person's personality, their persona, and ego development that makes them the individuals that they are, but leads to a more nuanced and differentiated motivational schematizational factors in them that may differentiate them from the archetypal expressions of their type, excluding any sort of maladaptive or ego-inflationary elements or anything of that matter. So on to the topic itself. Superordinate traits in one's cognition I have seen to be things such as personality disorders. Though I said not maladaptive things, I do not find that's just the DSM categorization for such things. So I do not find personality disorders in of themselves in certain variabilities and degrees to be maladaptive qualities of persona per se, and maybe I'll explain more of the reason I say that later. It would be personality disorders, and personality disorders have a range of spectrums, as in being closer to the schizotypal mood disorders, the anxiety disorders, the compulsory disorders, and the psychopathy or psychopathic disorders. And I think that when one hears an example of the anxiety disorder spectrums, the anxiety spectrum disorders would be things such as anxiety disorder, would be things such as neuroticism, high levels of neuroticism, would be things such as depression and various forms of manic depression, more so on the degree of type 2 bipolar disorders and other manic disorders that have a strong component in depressive elements. The overall tendency within the mind structure to have low levels of dopaminergic activity, high levels of cortisol, and low levels of serotonin to account for the higher levels and frequencies of cortisol's transmittance in the human brain. And so obviously that will inflect and influence itself on one's personality. One can be an ISTP, one can be an ESFJ, one can be an ENFJ, one can be an INTP, and suffer from any one of these disorders, and it greatly influence and color their lens insofar as their perceptive schema and their motivational patterns and how they see the world and how they experience things and how others experience them. The same can be said for the other spectrums of disorders per se, at least what the DSM calls disorders per se, and such as being autistic or being schizotypal, not necessarily full-blown schizophrenia, not necessarily full-blown schizophrenia, but there is a strong dichotomy in the way that these two brains are arranged, and one being tended towards stringency and associations and having very fixated focus, and deliberative capacities, to where one being much more broader in its associations of relevancy and connectivity amongst ideas and perceptive items of perception. So that would be schizophrenia, and the latter would be schizophrenia, and the previous or the prior or antecedent would be autism. And it's to say that these things have greater say in the directives of the cognitive functions, and less that the cognitive functions have any say in directing them. And that would be the first category, and to say that really personality disorders are superordinate traits, that they're ones that superimpose themselves on the psyche. And I don't think that they're ones that are, I don't think, given the neurophysiological evidence and the biological factors for these things, that they are things that people have because of any choice of their own, as in they are very real genetic dimensions that contribute to all of these things arising within an individual's psyche. And certainly there is factors of their prenatal environment and their early childhood development and their adult life. But interestingly enough, most of these things, except for autism and some anxiety disorders, show up typically in the ages of 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, and adulthood, and that becomes much more apparent and frequent in disorders like bipolar mood disorders, depression, and schizophrenia, and other types of things when hormonal levels have changed and the genetic blueprint has essentially laid itself out more in a very specific way, rather than the general sense that kids have more similarity to one another and adults develop more differences with one another as they grow on. And people attribute this to maturity, and certainly there are factors of one's choices, social constructions, sociality, communities, and early childhood experiences that play a role in this. But it also is too that the genes are very much susceptible at turning on, and there are delayed developmental patterns in the expressions of certain things, as it is a constellation, an amalgamation of things that are being expressed when you're looking at someone who has any one type of personality disorder. And they're rather complicated and multifaceted things that don't have any one root cause or reason for their manifestations. But they are superordinate factors of the psyche, as I consider them, and superimposing structures. The other would be more general specialized dimensions of characteristics that tend to come and be associated with rare dimensions of personality expression. And these dimensions would be highly sensitive, highly, I would say schizotypy. I wouldn't say highly creative. Highly creative is something that's used in its literature and psychology, but a student of Hans Eysenck came up with the terminology schizotypy, which I find much more suited in expressing that it is a rather interesting constellation of personality dimensions that has a greater associations with things like the Carriesworth gene and several markers that are responsible for the activity and levels of dopamine in a person's brain, and really that you get a very interesting constellation of factors being emergent in someone's personality by way of a little more leaning towards an expression of one neurochemical or a certain cocktail of neurochemicals over the other ones. A researcher, Helen Fisher, even postulates that you have specific dimensions of personality arising all completely out of single hormonal and neurochemical elements, insofar as one being more predominant in testosterone or one being more predominant in estrogen or serotonin or dopamine, that they will have a very real matrix. And she pulled that because very really for a long-standing history, since we've been able to look into the mind, we have been able to see that traits such as being risk-taking, prone to novelty, workaholism, or even psychopathy have a very strong association with the prominence of dopamine and also in like manner testosterone, because they are agonistic towards one another and recruit one another. They are co-conspirators in a lot of ways, and some traits that show up regularly, but you have some rarer personality constellations such as schizotypy and being highly sensitive that can find themselves, that can be mapped on and superimposed on any personality type. It's interesting that INFPs are much more sensitive than most personalities in general, but if you find someone who, say, is another personality type that is somebody who is a highly sensitive person, they may not be introverted at all. They may, according to very recent research, that there is a good distribution in that community of individuals of being extroverted and introverted, and it leads me to even speculate that, and just because I've experienced or I've seen this, that people who are highly sensitive, they are not necessarily INFPs. They can be other personality types, and it seems that the tendency towards schizotypy or being highly sensitive have greater superordinate factors in one's psyche than the personality. There are things, when I say superordinate factors, I mean there are things that are going to influence the personality. I would say temperament is going to be influenced and skewed by these things. Maybe not skewed, but influenced and morphed, if you will, by these things, because there will be a tendency towards more asynchronistic expressions of things, individuals of these capacities and makeups per se, and that that ability should not ever be associated with preference, because when one has the tendency to display a certain directive and palette of characteristics and traits, there are more things at the helm and playing in the background of that picture than their cognitive functions in their type alone. And it's to say that also I think that IQ is also another superordinate factor. And I've said this, I think, in other videos, that IQ is something that is largely hereditary in some vantage points and hereditarily confusing in other vantage points. And what I mean is this, is that most people have the same IQ as their parents within a range of, and their grandparents within a range of given 5 to 2 points, more or less. But then you have where really strange phenomena can happen, where you have two people who are borderline mentally disabled have profoundly a child with that is profoundly gifted, and so it's a, who knows really what the whole, because that deal hasn't been sorted out through the genetic vantage point yet. And so it's just to say that there's an interesting relation between that and personality, and it seems that personality is just as much unpredictable. IQ is a lot more predictable in the way it'll show up in a person given their genetic lineage. Personality, however, is not, because people are, I don't know what really the genetic components of personality heritage is, because oftentimes when people say someone is like their father or someone's like their mother, that the individuals may not share the same personalities at all, but because they were raised by them, they have accepted and adopted a set of characteristics of behaviors that are very similar to the individual that raised them, obviously, as that would be the case because they were raised by them. But the behavior is not the metric and the determiner of what one's personality is, because personality very really is something that is a determiner of one's perceptive schematization and emotional, not emotional, but motivational perceptive schematization. What one is motivated to see and distinguish in the environment first is really what personality is. And it's largely influenced by one's temperament, and temperament is something that is made in the womb, and that the world does not get to choose and act on per se, but that the individual comes as and makes themselves up out of that template, which is their temperament. And I think that's where personality ultimately rests. And it's very really that is just as much as a dice roll as many other things. There's not stability in these factors per se, not in the same way that there's stability in height or even physical appearance. There seems to be too many traits involved per se for geneticists to map out certainly what we can scientists have been able to associate certain traits with the prominence of certain markers, but it's not as if we can look at one's genes and tell that they are an ENTP. That's not even, it's not even close to that. It's to say that, or whether or not somebody given their personality trait will have children of this personality type or that personality type, if that was something that was even studied. And it is something of interest to some researchers, but it's something that is studied, but it's not like as if it's something that is really viable per se, because there's not enough understood about genetics, and personality in terms of genetics is so complicated that height and other factors are somewhat like that, but they have a greater stability to them. That even if we can't single out everything, there's just statistically or consistently a trend in the predictive measures one can make by way of just familial association. There is not the same thing in personality in the slightest, but so it's for these reasons that people with high IQs have personalities, to the surprise possibly of many, but they can have children who have IQs that are within theirs, give or take 2 to 5 points. So the likelihood of them having highly intelligent children is far more likely. However, the likelihood of them having children with the same personalities as theirs is far less likely. So the likelihood and there's a greater possibility and reason to believe that people with high IQs also have differing personalities per se, because personality is far more of a crapshoot in terms of knowing what you're going to get than intelligence is. And it's much more reasonable for me to believe, given literature and specifically literature on the gifted population, to accept the notion that and IQ influences personality, but personality does not influence IQ. The personality one has does not say anything necessarily about their IQ. Their IQ seems to be something that is fairly independent and much more substantial and superordinate in its influence on the individual and their psychic constitution, rather than the personality making up the thing that the prefrontal cortex is. It's a consistent pattern that certain areas of the prefrontal cortex are robustly developed in these individuals, and even ones that are highly artistic and creative, they have a very strong leaning and greater right frontal and parietal lobes and tendency towards multiphasic processing of information, meaning that they take in a considerable more amount of information than the average person. Their prefrontal cortex, whether you're looking at somebody who's gifted in music or like, it's not, because gifts aren't talents. So whatever, I want to throw that out off the plate. And savantism is not, and being a prodigy is not closely linked to one's IQ per se, depending on the domain that one finds themselves being a prodigy in particular. But it's to say that the factor of intelligence just seems to be much more likely something that is independent of personality and something that influences it, rather than one having a certain personality guaranteeing them any IQ other than an average one. Though that's a fallacy, or just a misnomer and erroneous thought I find in most of the typological community, mostly within NT types, to be honest. And just because one is an NT does not mean that they're highly intelligent. I'll just say that on the onset. And just because one is an S-type doesn't mean that they aren't they can't be profoundly gifted. Personality is one thing. IQ is very much another thing, because the same things don't even seem to determine them in the phrenological patternization of the brain. We don't know where personality lives in the brain per se, and all the ways that it shows up. Personality seems to be in the substrates of the brain and the chemical makeup that tends to frequent itself in the individual, and the leaning and patternization of the nervous system of that individual, insofar as that introversion in the physiological sense is a bias towards the sympathetic nervous system, and acetylcholine, and extroversion seems to be, they seem to be in extroversion autonomic and fight or flight response, and it's adrenaline and they both have interesting relationships with dopamine, and it's to say that other things, insofar as one's disagreeableness, seems to be rather more associated with the prominence of the neurochemical and hormone testosterone in a person, and that's not something that's necessarily comes down to sex, even, which also leads to why there's association with workaholism and certain things in people who are highly dopaminergically based, and their tendency to be eccentric and even risk-taking, and these traits and these qualities. No, I don't know how they sort themselves out, but there's a much more nuanced picture, and it not being completely within the physiological regions of the brain. It's not as if the brain has the self per se in any one area, but that there are these there's a collection of centers that work together to make up the experience that we have and that make us up, and there is a great deal of instigation by various neurochemicals and their proportions within our brain and the various substrates that they travel through that give the picture of our temperament, and our personality is influenced by other factors as well, by the external environment, and this can too be somewhat of a changing and differentiating picture given epigenetic phenomenon and the other superordinate and imposing factors that are laid on top of the temperament that the individual has. But we do know, per se, where IQ is in the brain, and we know what it looks like for any person so far that researchers have taken and stuck them under an MRI to look at the patternization of their brain, what it exactly looks like, and there are a great deal of differences, and so far as brain size and nodes and different factors of idiosyncratic makeups per se, and but the amount of the density of certain things like glial cells or white matter in the brain, and astrocyte thickness, and the development and constituency of the prefrontal cortex, or just of the forebrain itself, is consistent. It's just, that's something that you find with all of them, and so it's not like there's a question in that, and there's a high deal in association with working memory in all of these individuals, and it's just, that's just the way it goes, and that's something that's going to be much more consistent rather than one's personality, and is going to influence one's personality rather than the personality influencing it. And I think that all of these things lead to a very real degree of coloration and variety, even in the personalities themselves. I think that one's individual uniqueness may come by way of one's falling on certain spectrums that we consider personality disorders at this point in time, but we will find out, I think, as more research goes on, because it's quite interesting to me that a person who is schizophrenic has a downregulation of their frontal regions, that there is not a great fidelity in the cortical structures, and there may be a greater amount of white matter, but or there's a less integrity of white matter per se. there is maybe a greater deal of synapses and areas for information to be sent through the brain in these individuals, but the tendency for the signals to leak out and jump from thing to thing leads to a tendency of loose association and using broader relevancy in one's categorical associations and representations, and hence the leaning towards loose associations. Now, I find that that's very interesting that can be observed in the brain. It can be observed in the brain when someone is depressive. Also, that there tends to be less fidelity in one region of the frontal lobes, and in a greater asymmetry and hyperdevelopment of other areas over certain ones. And it's not completely clear whether that comes by way of just experience, but I think at this point in time it's completely understood that nothing is completely genetic and nothing is completely cultural, that it's an amalgamation of the two things. But I do think that it more so has to do with the innate genetic components that one comes with, because those are the things that can be turned on and turned off by epigenetic phenomenon. You do not have genes suddenly spontaneously emerging. They only what comes in the code can be switched on and switched off, so it has to be there from the onset, I think, for the environment to act on it and bring it to a certain place and any one degree of extremity or not. And it's to say really that I don't think personality disorders are kind of disorders in the way that we readily think about them, and factors like low latent inhibition, if somebody has it, that is going to influence their personality rather than their personality influencing them. And it's so interesting that people, if one has low latent inhibition and they have an IQ of under 100, or at least on an average IQ, they will find themselves in the loony bin. And as you go up in IQ around 140 and 130, they tend to not have any sort of mental irregularities about them. They tend to be a little more idiosyncratic and odd about themselves than the normal person, but they tend to be highly creative individuals. To me, there is just this interesting structure that the brain is that has more to say about one's personality and the way it shows up than the personality itself. I would say sex is another thing, that whether one is male or female, that is going to influence their personality per se, and their personality is not going to influence that. Are INTP females different than most females? Yes, but INTP females are different than INTP males, or at least they can be. Same thing with INTJ women or any NT women. I have NT women as friends, and they are much more rational as individuals, but they have, I find it very interesting, they have a certain constellation of traits that is innately feminine that I can actively observe in them, as I dated an INTJ girl for a while, and even in her tendency to be rather more I would say choosy and stringent characteristics than some INTJ males I know is just something that's far more indicative of her being a female than her being an INTJ per se. And it's to even say with my bent towards analysis and rationality and logic, and something too that when feminists say that there are no differences in men and women, I'm not a misogynist. Hopefully nobody will take that from me. But there are very real differences between men and women. There are differences between men and women. There is a great deal of overlap and a great many traits that are androgynous and not male or female in of themselves, but the tendency towards certain things because of the factor of testosterone and its co-conspirator or cohort dopamine being prominent members within the male psyche do lead towards extremism and extreme expressions within the masculine nature. It's even where one can observe that you do not find even in women in the distribution of traits, particularly within intelligence. Women tend to have average intelligence and slightly above average intelligence, and they have slightly below. It's usually that they have a greater frequency of fitting into 100 to 90 to 120 and 130, and that's really where a majority of women sit at. Very few are on the other tail ends in being completely mentally handicapped and completely profoundly gifted, to where you have in men a very greater tendency towards being mentally handicapped or being mentally profound. It's strange, as there are very real greater selection pressures